Welcome viewers, my name is Alan. I made this course to explain what Ruby on Rails is. Basically, it's an introductory course for beginners interested in web development or just people curious to know about Ruby on Rails. This is the overview of the content I'm going to be covering in this course. So let's get started. So what is Ruby on Rails? Simply put, it is just a way of building web applications. The reason it is called a framework, it is because it has a set of rules. It is batteries included, meaning it has a lot of boilerplate code already written for you. So if you need maybe to configure a database, it is already done for you. You don't need to write extra code. And I think it is also important to differentiate between a library and a framework. The unique thing about Rails, it uses the Ruby language, and if you are new to web development, you realize most languages have their own frameworks because it is cumbersome to use just a language to write a software or a website. So that's why people use frameworks. It just makes the work easier. So let's go and discuss why you should use Ruby on Rails. Honestly, the main reasons why I should use Ruby on Rails are are based around the fact that it has been around for more than 20 years, meaning it is very mature and stable. So if you write a code today, they won't release an update tomorrow and say we are writing the framework. You have to learn again how to do things. So that maturity is very envied in the software world, and that is why people use it. It is also used in very big companies like Shopify, GitHub, and Basecamp. So it is battle tested and also has a lot of features out of the box. My favorite reason to use it is because it enhances your productivity. You'll find yourself doing a lot within a short time, and also if you are alone or with a small team, you can do a lot. And I think the main reason why people use frameworks is because it is you have to try it and see if your mind works that way. So if you should try Ruby on Rails and see if your mind operates that way. Because I find that most people like me and others have had the reason they use Ruby on Rails is because when they started using it, they found their brain just clicked with the way the framework works. So the best thing I can say is you try it and see if it works for you. But nevertheless, it is also has a lot of community support because there are many people using it who are very kind. It also has a large variety of gems, which is equivalent of packages. So if you want to do a task, probability is somebody else has done it and they have solved it, so they have a gem for it, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So let's go and see how it works behind the scenes. So Ruby on Rails basically follows an architecture called MVC, which is an acronym meaning models view and controller, which is basically used by many frameworks. But in itself, Rails is modular, so it is combined of several packages or plugins which work together to provide the Rails experience. They are divided into two, front-end and back-end, where front-end are prefixed with the name action, as you can see, and the back-end are prefixed with the name active. So you can go and read what each does, but it is important to know that each of them are independent and they can work even outside Rails. And with that, let's go and get started with our project. Before we start the project, it is recommended you have to have Ruby language installed in your computer. If you don't, you can go online and install. Also, if you are in Windows, I recommend using WLS2, which is Windows Subsystem for Linux. and also have a code editor. You can use whichever you like, but I recommend VS Code because it is just what I use. Without further ado, let's go and start writing some code. Right. Welcome back. Let's continue building this Rails app. The first thing we are going to do is open our terminal. I have already opened mine and type the words Rails new. This is how you create the new Rails app. Rails new, then the name of the app. If you forget the options you need, you can type dash dash help and see all the options you can pass into a new Rails app. As you can see, we have all these options which are available. You can choose your database, you can choose your JavaScript bundler, you can choose to skip text, to skip JavaScript. All those options are available, but for us, we are just going to choose a CSS framework. So to do that, we just say Rails new. We can just call our app checklist. The name of the app doesn't matter, and just pass in the CSS framework we use, which is Tailwind. For the database, if you don't choose it, will choose SQLite for you, which is okay by me. So let's generate this app. This will take some time, depending on the internet connection, but not more than 2 minutes. Alright, our app has finished generating, so we can go to the folder we created called checklist, and then we can open our code editor. I'm using VS Code, so I just type code and period and open my code editor here. Now, as you can see, there are a lot of folders generated. This is now what Rails generates, but they can be overwhelming. But the main ones which you will be using the app folder, because this is where your app lives, and your config folder, because this is how you configure things, and it is where your routes file is located, which is the entry point of any Rails application. So with that in mind, let's create our first model, or let's create our first table. To do that, we go back to the terminal. I clear these ones. So now I want to call our first table to dos, because we are basically getting to dos. So I generate, you can type generate or just G, as what we call a scaffold. A scaffold is used to create a CRUD application, which you can create, read, update, and delete. In this case, I want an application which you can create to-dos, and then we can delete them or read them or edit them. To do that, we name it singular of the table name you want, which is to be to-do. And also note there are other available generators. You can generate a model, a controller, and others. So after passing in the name, then you pass in the database attributes. For me, I want the name, which will be a string. Also note you can leave it blank if you such as a string, but for other data types you have to specify. And that's it for me. Now Rails will generate all these folders for me. As you can see, if I, for example, open the app, I go to the models, you can see there is a new file called todo.rb, now where the business logic will go. To start with, I can maybe start the server and see what we see in our browser. To start the server in Rails, you can say Rails, then S. Now this will start our server, but because I have Tailwind installed and I want to bundle the CSS, I can just say bin dev. So this will make sure that as I make any changes in the CSS, it will reflect here. You can either use this or Rails. So let me just use bin dev. So you can see it starts the application. It's also listening for any changes in our CSS. Now I can visit this route, this URL, and you can see here this is what we have when I open the server. Now this has an error which says migrations are pending, because when you create a new table, you create what's called a migration, and if you go back to our VS Code, by there you can just type Control P and go to the and navigate easily. So for example, this works when you know the file you want. For example, I know the file I want is a migration. So maybe if I wanted a route file, I can just type a route and open it here instead of going manually and searching in this other side. But for now, the one I want is located in the DB search for database, and you see a folder called migrate. This is where the migrations are created. After you migrate a file, that's when the table is generated and stored in the schema. So to run migrations, you can just use token stop the server and say rails db migrate. Or alternatively, you can come here in the terminal and just run pending migrations here, but most of the times you'll be using the terminal. After migrating the terminal, let me restart the server again by running bin dev. And now when you go to this and reload, now you see we have the homepage for Rails. Now this is a blank Rails application. This is how it looks like. But because we generated a scaffold, if you go to our routes, for example here, and say Control P routes, you already have a resources to do. So this was generated automatically for us, and what this does, it maps the resources generates all the HTTP verbs for this resource, which is to do's. So what it does, it maps a action to a controller. So for example, this will get, if you can open the Rails document and see what this does for us, if I highlight here and follow this, we can say resources takes in it's a method which takes in arguments and a block. So for example, resources for those who generate all these routes, get, put, delete. So it's just a shortcut of writing all this. Instead of writing all this, just say resources and the name of the resource. So that's exactly what is happening. And each of these resources is mapped to a controller. So if I go to slash to do's now in my app, you can see I go to the index section of the to-dos, and here I can create a new to-do and call it whichever. I can say go shopping, for example, create a to-do, and it is created. Now that is how you create a scaffold in Rails. And for you to know Rails or how it operates, the best way you can go through the files generated by the scaffold, because it is generally code generated for you, but normally you write it by hand. Or if you want to edit or add your sort functionality, you have to know where each code goes. So the main thing you have to know is the to do. You have to know this. You have to know what functionality goes there. Go to the controllers. The same thing, to do's controller. You have to know what each action does. But basically, it's just index, show, new, edit. Basically, the CRUD applications. And you have a before action here, which just means before you run any of this code, you set to do, which is a private method here down, which sets the to do to our instance variable by finding the to do's by params ID. We also have params, which are ways of Rails making sure you are not adding params you don't want, which is a security measure. So before you add a param, before you add an attribute to the database, you have to whitelist it here. So you go through this and then you go to the views. Again, the to-dos, these are generated by a scaffold, and you see all these views generated. You notice we have to-dos, maybe I can bump it. We have others followed by an underscore. Underscore means it's a partial, which means by itself it cannot be rendered. You have to render it in another view. For example, if you go to the index action, you see index view, you see we are rendering to-dos. If you go to the new, to the new to the new page on new HTML, you see we are also rendering a form. So rendering, we render a partial. For example, render form means we are going and rendering this form and also passing a local variable to it, which will be a to do. But this a to do is an instance variable which we set in the controller. So that's basically, you should learn that. And this JBuilder is not very necessary because it's just JSON, which is unless you are building APIs or you're setting JSON, it's not necessary, so you can treat them. The downside of generating a scaffold is sometimes generates things you don't need, so you have to delete them later. So that's that. So, and now you have a full functioning card application. Now let's say you want to add a feature, or maybe you want to add, to make sure a name, when you add a name, you can create a to-do without a name, because now if you add a to-do, for example, now create a to-do, it will create itself. So what can we do? We can just say go to the model, because the model, we remember it is singular to do and the controller is plural. So I can just say validate and I can say name, and I want it to be true. Copilot is helping me. So remember this, if I can hover, is an active model method which allows us to validate what is in our views. So now if I try to submit a blank form, it will refuse. I can say wash dishes, maybe now it's good. But if we want now each name to be unique, you can still go and add another method here and say validate process through and say uniqueness. How do you say uniqueness? I want uniqueness to be case sensitive, so I just say uniqueness case sensitive false, like that. Now it can be a bit confusing when you are using Ruby because there are no parentheses or brackets, but this is a method and these are arguments you are taking, and this is a block we are just passing. So now this one, when we try to add, if I saved here, back to do, so if I try to add another to do with the same name as wash dishes, so it will just say it has already been taken. So the last thing I want to show you in this, maybe I go back. I want to, let's say I want to add a new column, so that I want a column which I can take completed or not completed. To do so, you go back to maybe I can go to another terminal here. I can open another terminal, bump it up and say, I see it the checklist and say Rails J. Now it generates a migration because we are adding a column, and we name the migration. We can name it in camel case or Pascal case. So I say add completed completed to dos, like that. And then I just say the column name I want is to be completed. The name now is a boolean because I want it to be true or false. Now remember, everything you can do your generator you can write by hand, but you can write manually, but this makes it easier. So if I go back to migrations, you see I wanted another migration which I want it to be, I'm adding a column to the table to dos, which is also a method, table to dos, which I want to be completed at first. Now this is easier because if I make a mistake, I can roll back migration, go back to the other state, and that is the beauty of migration. So I might just migrate this as db migrate, and when you go back now here, you realize we don't have the column here because I just generated a model. But when I go to the schema, you see here, I already had another column here called completed. But now I have to add this manually to my views and to my controllers. Now I can just go to my view file. So my form, I type here, I go to my form. Now this is the form which I'm submitting attributes. So I have a name, but I don't have any other. So I just need to add manually. I just copy paste this and add the label. This is a basic HTML form using Rails hypers, and just say completed. And now I don't want a text field, I want a checkbox. And you have to match it with the column in the database which is completed. And I'll delete this, I don't think I need this. Maybe I can leave just some margin, top of maybe 3 or 4. And remember, these are just tailwind classes. So if now I go back and reload the page, I have an error. Undefined without checkbox, I have a typo. Should have an underscore here, checkbox. How that should work. You see now, if I type go shopping, or maybe go to the gym, and I say completed and I create to do. Now if I go back, you see it is still not coming in here. This is because one thing, I did not highlight it, I did not whitelist it to the controller. Another thing, in the index section, you can see I didn't add that column here. So if I go to my index, you can see index section is rendering to dos, which is this partial. And this partial is rendering only the to-do name. So I also have to duplicate this and say to-do.completed. Now this, when I come here, all to-dos now we have a should not be name, should be, I can call this status. And you reload, now you can see they have a status, but none of them has a value because it is not less whitelisted. So we have to go to the controller, to do's controller. Remember, controllers are plural. So I just go here and permit that which is completed. And you realize in Rails we use samples, which is a lot, which is just a name of a thing, which is better than string because it is immutable. So now if I save, if I don't need to do here, or I just edit this to do, and I say it is completed, and I update, and I go to the home page, you can see the status is true. But the others have no status. So for example, what if I want all to do is to have a default status of false? So back to I need to go back to my database. Maybe I close everything here for now. I can go back to my database and add another column. But this is where migrations come in handy. And now I can add that to the database. I say default false. So this meaning by default I want to do to be false. Now, and rolling back, you can roll back as many times as you want. So just rolled back once. I don't think I rolled back. So db roll back. So now after adding that, now that should work. I migrate again. Now all to do should have the false by default. As you can see that it's happening. So that's how you create Rails apps, to-do apps. And if you go through all the files, reading slowly by slowly, understanding how Ruby works, because Rails is basically Ruby with some additional methods to make work easier. So that's it from me.